striking manifestation of our new age, of our new world order, is the fact that a how-to book on suicide was published, was received with an enormously successful reception, and was perched on top of the advice category of the New York Times bestseller list for several weeks. The book, of course, is Final Exit by Derek Humphrey. Incidentally, another book has been released on suicide called The Goodness of Planned Death by Dr. Jack Kevorkian. I'm Julius Smetona. This is What Catholics Believe. Today we will consider suicide, the emerging public debate on euthanasia, and final exit. Joining me are one, Father William Jenkins, pastor of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus Church in Parma, Ohio, and Father Clarence Kelly, spiritual director of St. Joseph's Novitiate, a congregation of traditional Roman Catholic sisters in Round Top, New York. Fathers, first I'd like to ask you, what is the Catholic teaching on suicide? And I'd like to preface that question and perhaps elaborate on it by referring to a recent article I saw in a Catholic newspaper, a Novus Ordo Catholic newspaper, by a Father John Dietzen, who answered the question of the sinfulness of suicide. A woman said, someone said once that suicide was all right and approved by Catholics. Is this true? Well, the priest goes on and he begins by saying that Catholic moral teaching did not fall full-blown into our hands. It developed over a period of time. And then he said, quote, "The area of morality about which you speak is a good example. During the early Christian centuries, in the time of the great Roman persecutions, killing oneself in the face of imminent torture and death was looked on with great praise. Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, died in the year 340, provides our best window into the first Christian centuries in the, quote, history of the Church from Christ to Constantine," title of the book. While their fellow Christians praised highly those martyrs who endured the horrendous tortures and trials before they finally died, he tells of others who, quote, unable to face such a trial, and before they were caught and came into the hands of their would-be destroyers, threw themselves down from the roofs of tall houses, regarding death as a prize snatched from the scheming hands of God's enemies. Women were praised for throwing themselves to their death rather than submit to abuse. Quote, "By deed that spoke more loudly than any words," says Eusebius, "she proclaimed to all men then living or yet to come that the only unconquerable and indestructible possession was a Christian's virtue." So there he stops there. Then he says, to be specific, the Church's teaching based on God's lordship over our lives is that any attempt to take one's own life is objectively, seriously sinful. The individual's subjective responsibility, of course, depends on many factors. And then he apologizes. He says, "We have, or should have, learned much as a community of the Church without applying gospel values to human life. Indeed, if history has anything to teach us, it is that even yet we have not learned it all." What is the Catholic Church teaching on suicide? What has it been for all time?
Well, let me first say that that particular exercise in theology is typical of what is found in Catholic schools, universities, and seminaries. There's a great deception, like unto the deception of Lucifer, which he foisted on Eve when he said to her, "Why has God not allowed you to eat from the trees of the garden?" And she said, "Well, God has allowed us to eat from all the trees except from the one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil," and so forth and so on. And the devil said to her, you are not allowed to eat of that tree because you will have the knowledge of good and evil and you will be like gods. A deception, a lie, an attempt to confuse and to pervert the beliefs of Catholics by the misrepresentation and the misapplication of certain things. The Catholic Church has always held, from the very beginning, and it has always been taught in Revelation, that the direct taking of innocent life without the authorization from God is evil, intrinsically evil. Only God has the right to directly take innocent life. No one else has that right. God has given to the state the right to punish with capital punishment certain crimes. God has not given to us individuals the right to do that. We do have a right of self-defense. We do have the right to kill someone if that is the only way we can stop an unjust aggressor. The state has the right to put to death people who have committed certain crimes, but nobody has the right to directly take innocent life. Neither the individual, a mother, a doctor, the state, the world, or anyone. No one has the right to take innocent life. This has always been the teaching of the Catholic Church. And any claim, for example, like that claim, he's probably referring to an instance in which someone, a virgin, fled from a would-be attacker and perhaps jumped from a certain spot, not with the intention of dying, but with the intention of escaping the would-be attacker. In other words, if she intended to kill herself to avoid this would-be attacker, she would be guilty of murder, of suicide. But that is typical of what you find. The deception in the seminaries today, and I know it from my own experience. When I was in a seminary, Immaculate Conception Seminary in Huntington, Long Island, which was imbued with modernism, even though it was a kind of conservative seminary, it was the same thing, the same attempt to deceive and to put forward things as being true, which are simply not true. It's just a lot of, if you'll excuse the expression, baloney.
But they're very successful at this because they give half-truths. They've used half-truths to foist this entire so-called reform on the Catholic people. When people begin to do a little further investigating, in resources that most people wouldn't have available to them, by the way, when people do finally do some investigating on their own, they find out that they're not being told the whole story, and that the facts that they're being given are very distorted. As Father Kelly says, there were instances of those who even misunderstood the teaching of the Church and went to excesses, but these were exceptions. The Church always condemns suicide. It's a mortal sin against the fifth commandment. And one who takes his life in order to avoid hardship, even torture, is committing a mortal sin, and God will condemn that person to hell. He alone will decide when a person is called before him for judgment.
In fact, contrary to what most people might expect, suicide is a worse sin than murder. And the reason it's a worse sin than murder is because we have an obligation to ourselves. For example, the killing of a brother is a worse sin than the killing of a stranger. Both are murder, and both are equally damnable, and both would be punished by the fires of hell if a person died without repenting. But the killing of a brother also violates piety. There is a certain wickedness and evil, and of course, for example, the crime whereby one would kill his own mother, like Nero, the Roman emperor killed his own mother, or had his mother killed, that has a viciousness and a malice which is unspeakable. Suicide is like unto that, because of our obligation to love ourselves and to secure our salvation. So to directly kill ourselves is a monstrous and wicked crime.
There's a related issue to suicide, namely euthanasia. I'd like to ask you about the Church teaching on euthanasia, or so-called mercy killing. The question of starving patients who are gravely ill or in comas has surfaced. In fact, the bishops, the U.S. bishops, and I'm sure bishops of other countries, seem to be moving towards support of the starvation of patients as something that is consistent, say, with Catholic teaching. In fact, the bishops of Indiana, not too long ago, said that starvation of patients was permissible in a number of cases. This, I believe, was from an issue of The Wanderer, May 23rd, 1991, where I saw this. What is the Catholic position on euthanasia?
The Catholic position on euthanasia is that it is murder. Directly inflicting death on an innocent person just because someone decides, whether it's the person himself who's left some kind of a so-called living will, or a relative decides that he would be better off dead, is murder. That's all. And, you know, this judgment of who would be better off dead and when he would be better off dead is terribly subjective anyway. And the danger is just inconceivable. for who deciding who would be better off dead. But regardless, I mean, it is a form of murder, there's no question. And no one has, and not an individual nor any government authority has the power, the right to decide who would be better off dead. And no one can decide that for himself, whether he would be better off dead.
I think part of the problem in the abortion debate, in the euthanasia debate, and so forth, and even in the capital punishment debate, is a lack of understanding of what murder is. Some people say murder is the killing of a person, and that's not true. The killing of a person could be murder, or it could be the execution of a criminal by the state, or it could be an act of self-defense against an unjust aggressor. Some people even say the killing of seals is murder.
Or whales.
You know, or whales is murder.
At least seals are
and they wouldn't say, in many cases, those people would say the killing of an unborn baby is perfectly okay. But what has to be understood is what murder is. Murder is the direct taking of innocent life. That's what it is. Those words are key to understanding the difference between the legitimate taking of a criminal life or self-defense and so forth. You must understand that it is an innocent life, and it is the direct taking of that innocent life. In every single case, without exception, it is evil. It is intrinsically evil. And the people who are against abortion in most cases are involved in an essential contradiction. They don't understand that if you can justify abortion in one case, you can justify it in every case. You can only condemn it in every case if it is intrinsically evil. Evil by its very nature. And it is, in every single case. There's not one single exception to this rule. The direct taking of innocent life is always evil. If it is the life of the individual himself, if it is the life of an unborn baby, if it is the life of some segment of society, for example, that people don't like, you know, purists who might want to eliminate certain undesirables from society and justify it for the good of the state. It doesn't matter whether it's the life of an old man or an old woman, whether it's the life of a deformed baby or a retarded child. It doesn't matter. It is evil, evil, evil in itself to directly take innocent life.
There's a question which perhaps is a little more subtle, and it received quite a bit of publicity with numerous cases. There have been patients who have been in comas for years and were kept alive artificially by respirators, by machines that help the cart keep going, and so on and so forth. As medical technology keeps advancing, I'm sure that there will be more and more cases of people who 20 years ago would have been dead on the spot might be kept alive for another 5 years. How do you deal with cases where the only reason a person is alive is that all of his vital functions are being supported mechanically? At what point is it legitimate, as they say, to, quote, pull the plug, or is it ever?
Well, if I might, you have to distinguish between taking a life and allowing a person to die. In other words, it is not our obligation to fill the pockets of the medical profession with all of their billions of dollars and their technology to prolong a life as long as we possibly can. If there is the prospect of a person regaining his health, then even in the case of a doctor, he should take extraordinary means to preserve a person's life. But it is not the teaching of the church, nor is it the commandment of God that we ought to avoid death at all costs. I mean, there is a certain worldliness and a certain materialism involved in the idea that it is necessary for us to prolong life as long as we possibly can. The point is this. From a positive approach, it is absolutely forbidden to directly take innocent life, no matter what the circumstances are. On the other side of the question is the question of a person who is dying. What are we obliged to do from a moral point of view? We are obliged, with regard to our own lives, we are obliged to take ordinary means to preserve our lives. We're not obliged to take extraordinary means. Now that obligation, I believe, with regard to others is greater. In other words, a doctor has a greater obligation to preserve a person's life than the person has himself. teaching of the Catholic Church is that we're obliged to take ordinary means to preserve our lives. We are not obliged to do every conceivable thing to get every moment we can in this world. I mean, after all, we are going to die, and after death comes the judgment.
You're watching Suicide and Jenkins.
You know, Julius, it seems ironic that at a time when technology is taking us so far that we can prolong life beyond what was ever conceivable just a few years ago, there is also a cult of death arising. It is sung about in the rock music of the day. The second leading cause of death of teenagers is suicide, just after automobile accidents. And when a doctor arranges a machine, creates a machine for a woman to put herself to death in the back of a van in a parking lot in Michigan, draws nationwide headlines and a tremendous amount of controversy, but a lot of support, a lot of support. And it's clear that that there is a movement in this direction. It's being pushed. The idea of being able to terminate your own life and get on with something else, whatever it might be. This is sick. This is really sick. It is a sort of an aspect of the sickness which has people going up to islands in the northern seas of the world and spray painting baby seals so that they will not be put to death for their skins. But meanwhile, abortionists back in their own hometowns are making hundreds and hundreds of dollars every day putting children to death. And this does not faze them in the slightest. They think that people should have a right to do this. There is something really distorted in the world, very evil in the world today, and we can see the attitude of the children growing up today with the death education in the schools, which is often a required part of the curriculum, and the message that is pounded into them in rock music, that death is better than life. Death is a solution to everything.
This is, to my way of thinking, these are the kind of people, or if the human race has reached this state, this is the race that will not only accept the Antichrist, but will love him.
It is an example, I think, of how the devil takes virtually every aspect of the true religion and reverses it for his own evil designs. For example, the saints in sacred scripture say to think about your last end, and if you think about your last end, you won't sin. The saints tell us to think about the fact that when we die, there is a judgment, and the judgment that we receive determines our eternal destiny. In fact, the condition of our soul when it leaves the body determines whether we will burn for all eternity in the fires of hell, or we will burn with love for God in heaven for all eternity. And what they have done is they have taken this realistic approach to death, this reasonable taking into consideration of what happens after death, the judgment and so forth, and they have changed it into a perverse and twisted and really sick thing. Father Jenkins mentioned this death education. They actually take children, teenagers, and in some cases grade school children, to morgues to touch dead bodies. They actually do that. They have the children, one by one, put their hands on dead bodies to experience death. They take them to mortuaries to examine and to feel caskets. They have them write their own obituaries. They're doing this in public schools in New Jersey and in many other parts of the country. This is really sick. These people are sick.
This is a school program. And the teachers often instruct the children not to breathe a word of it to their parents. In fact, I just had some grandparents come through my school in Cincinnati and tell me their own daughter had to pull her little first grader out of the school, the public school he was in, because the teacher had introduced herself to the children but said that was not her real name, and that at the end of the year she would tell them her real name. And she warned the students, the little children, not to tell their parents anything about what went on in the classroom, because if they breathed a word of it, whereas she might not see what they were doing, that the stuffed bear sitting up on the top of the bookshelf saw everything, and he would know.
That's sick.
So these children were living in mortal fear of her, and the parent, the mother of the children, went in and talked to the principal and discussed this matter with the teacher, and came away with the understanding in her own mind that the teacher was actually a witch, a practicing witch, and this was the name she was going to reveal at the end of the school year. You know, this preoccupation with death is so serious today that these books that you mentioned at the beginning of the program are like a bullet in the head of thousands of people who are suffering from depression, as many of our teenagers today are. So they have nothing to live for, and if they have nothing to live for, then what have they got to lose? That these people are murderers, as far as I'm concerned, who are turning out these manuals on suicide. They're inviting all of these people who have problems to end it all in this way. And as I say, it's as good as a bullet in the head for many people.
And to lose their souls, too.
That's right.
To lose their souls. If those people believed that whatever problems they have in this life, the taking of their own lives would multiply that problem by a factor of 10,000, they wouldn't do it.
You know, we've talked a bit about the suicide euthanasia cult. I think it's very important, too, to discuss a little bit the Catholic attitude on dying, especially as I'm sure many people are getting closer to that time, or who knows, maybe this very night they may be visited by death. I'd like to ask you about what is the Catholic attitude, especially when contrasted with something like this. I saw this in another so-called Catholic newspaper by a Sister Joyce, and it's called The Troubling Case of a Book on Suicide. Well, she was a little more critical of the book than the priest. But then she says, what are you supposed to do about death? Reach out in some way, okay? Support the family with a note or drop off a warm meal. Listen. Allow the person to share their story and their experience of fears with you. A gentle, caring presence is important. Communication. Seek out others who have faced a death in their family to talk about their own uneasiness or uncertainty about what to say or do. And finally, lastly, pray. How are you to pray? Personally reflect in your own feelings about death. Pray to be able to reach out beyond your own fears. What is the Catholic teaching on preparation for death?
Well, we know for a fact, it is a truth of revelation that after death comes the judgment. And that judgment will determine whether we will see for all eternity the beatific face of Christ or the miserific face, as Bishop Sheen used to say, of Satan. And that we will be possessed by one or the other forever and ever. There is a hell. There is physical fire in hell. That physical fire burns more intensely than any fire on earth, and the souls of the damned are plunged into an abyss of despair and desperation and loneliness, the likes of which nothing on earth can be compared to it. On the other hand, those who save their souls, who die in a state of sanctifying grace, they are with God for all eternity. All the longings of their heart are satisfied beyond their wildest expectation. The joys of heaven are so great and so intense, in fact, that God has to give to the soul a new strength called the light of glory, that it may see Him as He is, love Him, and rejoice in Him. These are facts, and these are truths, and these are the things that should be told to the people, and the children should be told, and the teenagers should be told that suicide is murder, and it's worse than if they went and shot their friend, and therefore if they go and take their own lives, they will have to answer to God as murderers and be judged and condemned and damned for it.
Interesting to note, not one word about invoking the aid of the Blessed Virgin Mary or Saint Joseph, of having sorrow for your sins, of begging the mercy of the Sacred Heart. What are some practical recommendations you would give someone who's on their deathbed? How should they pray? What should they do?
Well, I'd say the very first thing is they have to make a very good confession. They have to examine their lives. If they are dying, they should be told they're dying. Okay? Now, people think that they're being nice to their friends and relatives when they withhold this information. They're being very charitable. When my mother got cancer, was months away from death, I went and told her. I told her exactly what the doctor told me. I told her that she was going to die. And her response was very encouraging. She says, well, that's okay, you know. But the point I'm trying to make is it's an act of charity to tell them, because then they prepare to face the judgment. Once they have made a good confession, they receive the sacraments, they've straightened everything out with regard to that, they should have an immense trust in the mercy of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. They should be aware of the fact that the devil will come to discourage them, to fill their hearts with fear, to perhaps even tempt them to despair over their past sins. They should have this immense confidence in the Sacred Heart of Jesus and in the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and abandon themselves.
You've been watching What Catholics